Okay, so the following session, the moderator for the following session is Andrew Tuvey. Andrew Tuvey has over the years developed an open and eclectic attitude towards composition, never wanting to be pigeonholed. He has created music in many styles that can be complex, simple, and crisscross between interwoven musics. Exploring his passion for many genres of music, his studies with Jonathan Harvey, Michael Finney, and Morton Feldman enabled him to establish a wide variety of influences that led him to be open to a range of compositional possibilities, not following a single path or style. Today, Tuvey is visiting composition tutor of Royal Birmingham Conservatoire. His music has been commissioned and performed around the world and includes to date over 125 pieces from opera, orchestral, ensemble, chamber groups, and solo pieces. Much of his music can be heard on his YouTube channel or on his website. So welcome to Andrew, the moderator for this session. And we begin with and Peter Weigald has come in as well. Welcome to Peter. So we begin this session with Chen-Hui Jen. Chen-Hui is a composer, poet, and pianist whose music presents an imaginative, spiritual, and poetic space with subtlety and sophistication. She writes concert music for diverse instrumentation, including orchestra, chorus, solo, and chamber music for Western and Asian instruments, as well as electronics. Chen-Hui's musical works reflect an angle of contemporary art music and often evoke a captivating atmosphere that integrates time, sound, color, and poetry. She earned a PhD in music at the University of California, San Diego, and currently serves at the Florida International University as a part-time faculty and as the pianist in the Few Nodus New Music Ensemble. So welcome to Chen-Hui. And you have 20 minutes for your presentation. When you have 5 minutes left, I'll give you a warning.
Okay, thank you, George, for inviting me for this. And let me try to share my tab of the slide, the Google slide here. Okay. I guess it is here.
Yeah, we can see it. Okay.
Great. Yeah. And so today I'm going to talk about internal traces in my compositional practice and focusing on the discussion on my piece Into Silence and Keep Falling for cello and piano. And so first of all, to discuss the internal traces in my compositional practice, I'm going to start from two aspects. One is my general musical insights and approaches, which reflect my research field, artistic interest, and perspective. The other is uniquely about my life and compositional path, which intimately connect with my poetic aspect and musical choice. First of all, my general musical insights and approaches may provide you some background of my works. My main research field is refinement and transformation, orchestration, text and poetry, setting in music, and also new music involving traditional and non-Western instruments. I have been always interested in poetry, that I cannot separate my perspective of musical composition from poetry. I was also interested in experimental music and have spent years learning practice of just intonation, polyrhythm, and acoustic phenomenon. Having synesthesia makes me particularly interested in color, including the timbre and its associated sonic texture. Combining poetry and color, I consider music an organic unit of space and time and a self-reflection. Musical space-time, mostly texture, including layers plus time motions, including harmony, voices, lines, but together. I used to think about lines and phrases, but recently more obscure between a sound and a texture flow in time. This concerns a lot of analytical and technical practice on musical materials and structure. However, those to me are the most fundamental part of music. When I approach a work, either as a composer or a performer, I input my personal insert into and my interpretations of an idea or a work. I insert myself and view from my own perspectives, and this is how I connect myself to a work. For example, if I'm writing about an ocean, this ocean has to be my experience, my view, my imagination. I build my personal connection to the ocean instead of a general image. I may have different interpretations of the same ocean from time to time. Once you are there, you look back after a year or after a decade, you have different interpretations. You think and locate yourself differently. Following the personal perspective, we create a liminal space between materials and our mind. In my practice, I transfer ideas in different aspects, including hierarchical level of surface, middle ground, and background, as well as obscure metaphor. I usually collect and look into my ideas, how much it might expand and what it could mean. For example, mountain clouds. In my first imagination, it would be a lot of white and pink noise. Things come and go, fade in and out. But what do this image mean? When, where, and how close or how far are you? Which moment was that? These angles all take you to different directions. Once I got my mind more clear, I elaborate each idea and find its unique meaning to myself and put into practice and explorations. For example, everybody is seeing the same cherry blossoms here, but thinking about cherry blossom, you might remember 10 years ago at a specific place, a cold rainy day when you just broke up from a relationship, that your unique life experience for your own interpretation. You will therefore always associate this cherry blossom with your emotion and certain mental or physical state. Therefore, the cherry blossoms start to play a certain role in your work. And to me, this is a very important thing to practice and explore all those ideas and elements that get close to it. And about this piece, Into Silence and Keep Falling, which I wrote in 2016 for cello and piano. And there's an excerpt from the program notes. And there was a moment in my life when I feel the entire world is silent and isolated. All I hear is my own heartbeat and illusion from a vivid dream. A blurry but familiar scene of an ocean. However, I don't know where this nostalgia comes from, either from a region or from the past. As I've been traveling and as I more often found my inner self in the dreams where all my conscious and subconscious memories and thoughts meet, deeply printed but mostly speechless. And here you see a couple of pictures that I took. One is from the Qinhui Cliff in the east of the Hualien, and the other side was from the Black Beach from La Jolla, where I spent 5 years in the west coast of the USA. Next page. I jumped. I actually typed out the whole program notes. And one thing was the idea, poetic idea, expanding and vanishing towards the west or towards the east, endlessly and trustlessly. And if you can read Chinese, you can see what I originally wrote in Chinese as well. I wrote this piece basically, first of all, for that workshop in Cambodia in 2016. But that was a moment I feel just like whole entire world was silent, isolated. Therefore, I wrote the piece, and that was a very difficult moment. And now we're going to dig into it and introduce a little bit more. To discuss this piece, Into Silence and Keep Falling, there are a few different aspects, including poetic meanings inside the piece, the path of my cello and string writing, how I explore musical ideas on the instrument, and also how I connect poetic metaphors with musical gestures and implications across different works. Finally, also to overview the piece's unique role in my compositional timeline. First, following the work's poetic title, Into Silence and Keep Falling, a few images are directly there, the motion of falling as well as silent state. There are also some internal images of moonlight, notion from my life that I repeatedly dream of, and the twilight, a metaphor of a darkening state. Some of these hints appear in multiple of my works, but in different interpretation. And that was very interesting because I started to write this piece during a very, very cold winter when I saw all those snow slowly fall, and that was a few weeks I was spending in Tucson by myself, and I didn't really take picture or video because I got really terrible flu during those times, and I remember all those silence and certain kind of darkness in the pen. And let's go back to talk about the silent state here in the work. Where I approach the silent state, it's not trying to represent a physical state of lack of sound or event, but a progress listening to and seeking inward. From the outer state of static and absence of something, it reflects my mental association of voicelessness, isolation, and distance. I later wrote another piece for piano and electronics titled Onto the Silent Peaks, carry a similar but darker ideas. I use the same way to deal with other metaphors, and I will provide a few musical examples when I discuss musical gestures and implications. Here I'm going to show one of the examples of an ocean with my sketches in the next slide. So in this sketch you're looking at, is from a scan from my sketchbook. I indicated after the falling passage, so basically the middle passage, it starts to get foggy and blurry. And interestingly, even though I already sketched out the middle passage, I couldn't figure out how I am going to realize it until much, much later. One day, I had a dream of the ocean, which I drew out right after I woke up, which is this picture. Before I forgot this vivid image, and I wrote down the description, the ocean in a dream. The moonlight shines on the ocean, while the stones reflect in crystal colors under the clean greenish water. I hear the surging waves under the cloudy sky, filled with the moon's rainbow-colored halo. And that was basically like one of the very central sketch of that piece for the middle passage after the falling. And I'm going to show the next one because I talk about I ran into a lot of trouble doing what is missing the wave, how I'm going to do it. And until I took the trip and I saw the ocean and I hear the ocean and realized that. And for that passage, I actually have a quote like ocean wave. They remind me this piece by Ravel, Une barque sur l'océan, basically the third piece of the Miracle. And there's a polyrhythmic arpeggios happen. And in this piece, that middle passage, that reflects the similar things with like arpeggio, but a little bit irregular and with different kind of moving patterns. So there's an excerpt of my piece in the middle passage that is responding to this kind of image, drowning in the ocean wave. And the musical flow is also somewhat similar to that kind of pacing. It's like pace out, and getting faster, getting slower, and add a little bit of jittering. And I think I inserted this audio from the Google Drive, and I don't know if it will play. Let me see. Let me know if you cannot hear anything. That is a short excerpt. And let's keep going now. The second dimension is about my string writing, particularly for cello. I'm a pianist. I'm not discussing really about my piano writing since I spent over the 90% of my life playing piano and then myself premiere all my piano works. But for the cello, in 2013, I met our colleague, the incredible cellist Jason Calloway, when we moved to Miami. And he's a new music enthusiastic, and we have performed John Harvey's Advaya and Earl Brown's music for cello and piano together in concerts. Since then, I always have his playing in my ears when I write for cello, although my cello writing was quite challenging to him as well. In the first piece I wrote for him, that's before this piece, and as Hovering Ashes in the Quarter Moon for cello and electronics, I experiment a huge amount of cello harmonics that most of the cellists would tell me there's no harmonics there and required very, very subtle bow control that is no less than the requirement for classical repertoire. This work, Into Silence and Keep Falling, was written afterwards, in which I explore further in subtle bow control of overtones, basic harmonics, and also potential subtones as a crucial part of the musical lines and texture. I kept refining and practicing on similar ideas in my following works, including the most recent solo cello piece, Across a Sea of Clouds. And those examples in the following slides, and I will show like excerpt between those cello pieces writing, and you can see some like paths of that. So this example is the first piece I wrote for Jason, and As Hovering Ashes in the Quarter Moon. And in some like passage, you can see this explains how precise I want to explore and hear those colors in the harmonics and harmonic trios and try to have a control of them. And there's like just a half-minute excerpt of that. And the next one is going to this piece, and I have also like 30 seconds. And I use the same ideas of harmonic trios and bow-controlled harmonic timbre in the piece. I wrote out quite a bit of the outcome pages and as expected result of the bowing and the fingering control, and just play just a little bit here. The beginning. We recorded during the quarantine. And because time is limited, and I'm just giving a little bit of idea of how things are going, and showing the next one. Basically, in the next one, the more recent work, I still use a lot of this kind of harmonics, but only provide real sound pitches when needed instead of everything like in the previous piece. This also reflects how I make progress experimenting the sound I want with the notation communication with the performer. To discuss the musical gestures and implications across different works, this would be endless because this matters much more to me than any styles, philosophy, aesthetics, or techniques, because those internal implications direct and the majority of my musical decisions and how I personally connect with all the exterior elements. Let me provide a couple of most obvious examples in the piece. First of all, I use a wide definition of motifs with detuned intervals and expanded, compressed, or distorted temporal durations. Second, I reuse pitch collections as certain harmonic components from multiple works of mine as my reinterpretation of something, maybe an image, an emotion, an aura, a memory, or so. I also associate timbral and spectral components with certain poetic meanings and combine them all together into overall texture and structural flow. This kind of musical implications primarily create an intimate and unique connection between myself and my creative work, which is like my secret signature alongside the individual work and analytical structure. And of course, the next one, I show a very, very brief example, the excerpt, and showing the use of this collection of the A, G sharp, C sharp, because that was a motif mostly from also another, like a melodic passage from a previous piece, and show just a little bit like the interval. And similar things reflect in the piece. And there's another example of excerpt from the same piece, but I use a different kind of reference of the melody passage and a harmonic passage. And showing very, very brief example of what happened of this harmonic passage. This is only 10 seconds. Basically similar to the harmony, but in different position. And also there's a G sharp, D sharp, E, and this kind of motif showing in my other pieces as well. And let me go back. And in this piece has similar things. And following this, similar things happen in another piece later after this piece. And here is a very brief timeline of my composition and my life during the recent 15 years with some selected milestone works that are more related to this work into Silence and Keep Falling. I'm now viewing this work from a more distant and more objective angle around 5 to 6 years after the piece was finished. That says I cannot remember all the plan or analytical details on the score, but I have a clear mind path how I went through, digest, and refine those thoughts and ideas. I have experienced a huge bottleneck during the transition period in 2014, 15, during those years. I feel like a failure composer, despite how much effort I put into my works. When I started to write this piece, and basically it took me more than half of a year to finish. I had had most an empty but a busy year beforehand. Going through those bottlenecks was painful, but made me learn a very, very important lesson. I'm putting together a musical work, and I'm building all the musical connections. If one part is missing, I can be stuck. And the missing part was how I relate myself to the work. After this work, I kept carrying and reinterpreting certain poetic images into multiple different a musical practice and the works, and I keep doing so. You see a lot of works after this, and these internal traces have multiple dimensions to carry my personal reflection under the musical meanings. They consist of my poetic interpretation and perception, as well as my compositional experiment and refinement. These traces are very intimate connections inside the pieces, how I insert my emotional state and my viewpoint into a work, and also how I transfer a similar idea between different works over time. And so you can see, oh, these things are related. That was my discussion, and I hope this brief talk provide you some guidance to my thoughts and help you to enjoy my piece Into Silence and Keep Falling for cello and piano when the recording comes out in summer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chen-Hui. So I'll hand over to Andrew for his reaction.
Oh, that's better. Hello. Thank you very much for all that information. And I must say, it's fantastic how you've managed to kind of pull your whole life and what you do literally in terms of you go to the sea, you actually draw a picture of that and you try to make an interpretation of that in your music, and there's fantastic connections, as I can hear even from the examples that you've just given us. So that's really fascinating to hear. I'm interested that you kind of see like spending a lot of time on a piece as not being necessarily a good thing. Like I spent 6 months working on this. Sometimes to put that amount of effort and thought and time into a piece is, I think, really worthwhile. And what's interesting, particularly for me to hear, is that you try to connect up what you do in your life with what you do in your music, and it isn't some kind of separate thing. You at one point mentioned about motifs and ideas within the piece, certain chord structures, and sometimes composers just work on those almost like a blueprint of how they might create something, but somehow you've incorporated your whole life. That does remind me, you mentioned my old teacher Jonathan Harvey, where with his cello pieces, there's a lovely solo piece, Curved with Plateau. He wrote a cello concerto as well. So I'm also wondering how much time you spent with the cellist, really working on the details of some of these harmonics that you use, some of these very detailed technical aspects of the piece as well, because they seem to me, from looking at the score, to be very effectively done. So I imagine from one cellist to the next, some of them will say, oh yeah, that's fine, and others will say, oh, can't really get how to do that. So that's really fascinating. And the fact that you obviously play all your piano music as well is quite spectacular. How do you find when another pianist actually works on your piece? Is that, do they find it easy like you might do?
To
Sorry,
me,
that's
I
a lot of
think,
information.
yeah. Well, I don't know other pianists because I always think I'm just a mediocre pianist. But the first time when I wrote for that cellist, we do spend about an hour talking about some details on the score and tell him what kind of like position, bow position, try to maybe move this a little bit slightly higher up, and then how about move this closer to the ponticello and then find it. This piece has been played by two different cellists, and I use the same way to discuss with that cellist. Basically, because I learned the violin long time ago, although I didn't play very well and I stopped playing, but I have some basic idea of the strings. So I have some idea when I use the harmonics, and I also know about how things might be changing by very subtle change, timbre control by the bow control, but of course this does require a lot of communication with the musician. Also, musician is willing to try it out what it is. Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's like,
I mean, I must
spend
admit,
an hour on it.
yeah, no, I must admit, I agree with you, because as a kind of okay viola player as well, I found it extremely handy to have a knowledge of some of the basics of string writing, because I working with a lot of students, I find that's probably the most difficult thing for many of them, is to get into the mindset of how you write effectively for strings. And obviously, exactly like you, I encourage as much collaboration and talking to players and other performers as possible. And sometimes I'm quite surprised that people don't always do that, and they write a piece and they might base it on other scores, looking at Jonathan Harvey or Feldman or whoever, and they forget the human interaction. So I'm very pleased to hear that you've really thought about that, and that's part of what your whole way of thinking kind of thinks about. Can you tell me, as someone who's interested as well, I look at a lot of art. I'm very, I'll say for the sake of art, I'm inspired by a lot of different art. And sometimes I have literally tried to reinterpret that in my own work without necessarily saying this is connected to a certain picture. I'm interested about the sketch that you made of the sea, and talking about the different, you're talking about the pebbles on the shore where the sun was kind of reflecting on them, and that the whole look of the sky in that sketch that you showed us. I'm interested, how often do you do that actually? Do you do a lot of your own sketches, actual, almost like paintings or drawings?
I used to draw more comics, and I know a little bit of painting, but I'm not professional. But because I have synesthesia, so I can build certain kind of image and remember how to represent it. And at the same time, I am always very fascinated by different kind of art or other art form or other things that just happen in the nature. So we can actually view things from this angle, or thinking about the pacing or the structure or something from a different angle instead of what we used to do in the classical music. And I think I'm always fascinated by that, and try to understand or use my own a very limited knowledge to understand maybe this passing is a little bit more jittering, this what kind of a density change, or this is a little bit expansion, that is a distortion, something like that, and try to understand that.
Yeah, but you've taken it a step further from, what I might do, which is to take a photo of the area. You've really kind of gone into the intricate details, which is very clear in your music as well. It's very detailed in terms of just trying to capture every particular sound and every particular connection, perhaps with, it's difficult sometimes to know when you're listening to a piece what emotions the composer has been through, apart from some perhaps obvious ones sometimes. So that's fascinating how you've really taken that to such a deep and thoughtful level. So well done. It's been very nice to hear what you presented today, and it's very articulate and clear. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, shall we open up the discussion to everybody? So thank you, Andrew. Chen-Hui, I'd really like to ask you more about this, your synesthesia and the way you experience it, the way it informs your composition or assists your composition, because I think the way you described it actually makes it, or the way you describe synesthesia actually frames it as something more interesting than people often think it is, actually, because we often think of it as a kind of direct translation from one sensory realm to another, and that there's a sort of direct relationship there. So you see the color red, you hear a sound, you see the color red. It's a very causal kind of relationship. But I think in your description of it, it sounds like that it's actually also connected to your emotional state and your life experiences. So there's actually a kind of synesthesia reaching into your emotional life and your life experiences, and as well as kind of visual perception or other kinds of perception. So how could you explain a bit more about how those different things interact?
Yeah, actually, to me, synesthesis is one of the way I learn the world, like how I perceive everything, and it gives me a compound perception of the sound, the color, and texture. But when I dig into my mind, I still need to kind of brush things out. And what did these things represent, and what these things mean to me, and then find where I am and what is the most important part of that. Yeah, so I would say with this synesthesia, that give me probably it's like how I learn the world a little bit more. So I don't separate, okay, this is A, that is B. This is only things I hear. This is only the things I see. But I have more connection between, for example, I see something and I hear the sound in the whole texture. And sometimes when I have the draft of the texture, and we might be in a different kind of emotional state, and to each piece we still have to think about, so why am I doing this? What is this texture mean in this piece? What do I want to say in this piece? Yeah, and that is very important to me. Yeah. So the synesthesia is like opening the door that I learn the world. I hear things, it's how I perceive the world, and it's a little bit harder to compare how I perceive the world from other people, because we all have our own perception and nobody learns things the same way, even without a synesthesia. Mm-hmm.
And how
I think, sorry, George, I think that I'm always fascinated by synesthesia, because we've done some projects with people with synesthesia at university, and I always remember thinking, when I first heard some Messiaen, actually thinking, I wish I could actually see some of the colors that Messiaen is thinking about, although you get a sense and you can kind of interpret what you think those colors might be, and there's certain ways of thinking about that. It's a subject that's always fascinated me, so it's particularly interesting to hear how closely you connect, as George said, all the emotional parts of life and the literal things that you see in front of you. So I also understand now why you would draw a picture of it rather than just have a photo, because it's far more intimate a connection than I might perceive myself. So that's fascinating. Thank you.
Chen-Hui, I don't know if anyone else wants to, if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment, you could jump right in or put your hand up. Either method is fine. But I just wanted to, we have a question. Someone's put their hand up. Okay, we've got Peter and Paul. Okay, very biblical. Okay, shall we start with Peter?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the biblical. early in the morning. It's a very fascinating presentation. Thank you. It's so organic. All the relationships, the personal and the external and the internal. It's the relation. It's out of interest that I commissioned Curve with Plateau, Andrew, that Jonathan Harvey piece for my ensemble Gemini. It's a wonderful piece. I think our relationship with metaphor is very complicated, and whether we do something that is about something or is something, and the word embodiment is very important. Whether the artist embodies the whatever the other vibrations or tries to describe them. When I teach leadership in front of a band, I always say you have to invoke, not describe, because you have to bring the presence of this, whatever, other vibration. But otherwise, you can say it's an F sharp and it's a G, and then you do a cloud, and then you do a glissando, and the player is gone. But if you just say, in fact, I'm going to say later, birds of prey, and the bird is in the room, then there's a real relationship with the metaphor, not a descriptive relationship with the metaphor. So I might talk a bit about that later, but it's really, with students I often talk about Benjamin Britten's first sea interlude. I don't know if you know, because it's the Suffolk coast. It's quite fun to say, well, is that the Californian coast? No. Is it the Spanish coast? No. Is it Devon? No. There's some extraordinary Suffolk quality in the opening of that sea interlude. So it's really interesting that you talk about your special relationship. We're talking about special relationships, aren't we, with a space, rather than generalized. It's not an ocean, but the ocean that you felt that morning. And maintaining those authentic relationships with the non-sonic is really important, really significant, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, the way to actually, try to do it musically is try to use our perception and digest, and then try to use the musical element to evoke what we want to represent. Yes. Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
Paul?
Oh, hello. Hi. Good to see you, Chen-Hui.
Good to see you.
I just have a really simple practical question, actually. You mentioned that you had two different cellists play the piece, and both times you were able to work with them and sort of fine-tune the actual playing of the piece. And I think that's great. I think that's fantastic. Do you think that I'm not trying to be picking on your notation because it's very specific and very carefully done, but do you think that if you were not there to actually describe exactly how to do it with the player, do you think that a player would be able to pick it up and figure it out? I only ask this question because a lot of times I feel sort of isolated. I'd like to work with the player, and I don't have the players around me who can do that. And so, I try to write some things, and then you don't always get the feedback. I mean, you're very lucky that you have somebody to work with there, but like if you would send this piece to somebody far, far away, do you think they could pick it up and use that notation and figure it out?
Usually, I believe I always try to refine my notation and make it as clear and communicatable as possible. But then performers being able to play it or not sometimes also depend on their own experience, because we don't know if somebody has played like a cello, how many level of the cello they actually know, because it's also depending on the performers how much they can do, and like how many kind of playing, how many sound they can make on their instrument, and this can vary. And of course, being able to communicate with musicians is a very good luck to tell them that maybe you can do more than what you used to think. And what I am on the notation is what I already kind of know what may work. This will take a little bit of challenge, but try to be a little bit more precise. For example, put your finger on this string, this specific position, and maybe slightly lighter your bow pressure, playing a little bit closer to cello. And of course, each instrument and each bow may be slightly different, and also the rust and status may change a little bit. But if it's not the usual harmonics, I write out the outcomes, like you try to aim on making this pitch, and sometimes they can actually try to work on that. Just the communication, how they might be able to work on that. That's what I think they may work. Yeah.
So you actually add a few verbal written instructions instead of only notation. You actually sometimes do try to explain.
Sometimes I actually, in my notation I try to be clear, like sometimes like certain position, fingering position, the string, and like bow pressure, bow position, and also sometimes if it's really like unusual harmonics, you put on the outcome what you expect, because things can work out if they work hard, if they know how to make the sound. Once they just randomly get it, oh, that is the sound you want. Okay, I'll try to work on that. And I see that our cellist actually is in the talk. I don't know if he agree or not.
Maybe he's staying quiet. It would be wonderful to keep discussing this and discussing synesthesia and all of these wonderful things. I'm aware of time, so I think we should move on to Gerlie's talk now. So thank you, Chen-Hui,
Thank
for
you.
a lovely talk. Thank you. Okay.